Malcolm, how are you?
I'm good. It's cold though here.
I know it's perishing here and damp, very wet actually.
Yeah, it's raining outside as well.
Chucking it down.
Hi, Bob.
Yeah.
Oh,
Can I just give it one more minute? I'm not certain if Laura's coming on. I think Laura's on holiday actually.
again.
It's Gareth. Hi, Gareth. Right, okay, make it 12:01. Shall we kick off?
Am I working? I can't hear Malcolm.
We can hear
Off for
you,
a second.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you, Gareth.
Morning, Mr. Stewart.
Now I can hear something.
Hi, Gareth.
Hi, Malcolm. Can you hear me?
We can. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Success.
Okay. So shall we kick off then? It's 12:01. People are still joining us, but let's go. Gareth has gone now. He was there, now he's gone. Just hang on for him for a minute. Oh, he's back. Okay, so so good morning, everybody. Hope you're all keeping well. We've just been discussing how cold and wet it is. I think it must be cold and wet right across the country at the moment, but it is December. So I suppose it's still really quite mild, I guess, for a December, but certainly not the Decembers of my youth when it would be snowing by now. But anyway, let's crack on. Right, okay, so I have with me today, I've got Liz. Hi, Liz.
Hi.
I've got Gareth. Hi, Gareth. And we have Naomi. Hi, Naomi.
Hello.
I think Laura is on holiday, but she quite often joins us late, so I'm not too certain. Kevin is buying a new house, so he's not going to be with us today. He's obviously paid far too much if he can afford a new house. Right, so in which case we'll kick off. I'm going to start actually with a bit of sad news. Those of you who are on this call who knew him, Dave Clarke, who was our former salesman, a big character at conferences and such. Sadly, he passed last Friday. So I chose this photograph here with Paula Doherty, who he never missed an opportunity to have a photo with Paula, so it seemed appropriate. But he'll be much missed. And if anybody wants to know any further details, I'll let them know later on. But yeah. Okay, so so Kevin's not with us, but I did want to pick up one bit of council tax news. So let's start on this and just speak about this for a minute. So MPs have announced that they're going to investigate council tax collection. So the government's launching an inquiry that is going to review whether the government should make changes to the legislation on the recovery of council tax. I suspect this is probably a bit of a Trojan horse for them to have a look at all aspects of council tax, because they say that the announcement, in the announcement they say that they're going to be looking at council tax arrears. They're going to be looking at support available to those who fall into council tax debt, and whether there needs to be changes to the law on the recovery of council tax arrears. They specifically want to know how different council tax support schemes affect council tax collection. And they'll be looking at the effectiveness of their own government guidance, which they sent out in August. What do you think, Naomi? Is this a bit of a Trojan horse, this inquiry, an early start to gear up for the next election?
Without wishing to be political, yes, I do think there is possibly one eye on the election. It will come as no shock to anybody involved in council tax recovery that the impact of a council tax reduction scheme will have a significant impact on the ability to collect from those who are financially vulnerable. So I'm not entirely sure I know what they're going to find out that's going to be a shock.
Yeah, I suspect this is probably just collecting data from stuff that they probably already have a pretty good idea. Gareth, I mean, this is, I mean, I know you're not particularly interested in council tax collection, but this does seem to me to be a way for them to also have a look at those different schemes and the way that the different schemes do impact. Are you going to be submitting any comments?
I haven't looked at what the kind of the terms of reference are yet. I would hope, in fact, that it is a way of them opening up a look at the schemes, because they've diverged so much across England and in such dubious ways in many cases, that I really do think that kind of postcode lottery side of things has grown beyond any kind of defence. I think I'm interested in it, particularly because of the fact that I really have this uninformed suspicion that the kind of balance between the harshness of the schemes and the failings, therefore, in actually collecting the payments from them really do have a direct relationship.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Liz, you've been around the block a bit.
Thanks, Malcolm. You don't have to insult me this morning. I wonder, I really don't know, but I wonder if it's a precursor to trying to bring council tax back into universal credit, the schemes.
I think that is quite possible. I mean, debt itself has been a pretty big conversation piece, hasn't it, for the Cabinet Office?
And will continue to be.
So
I think most people would welcome it being brought back in to as part of universal credit, with the probable exception, I suppose, of people working within local authorities, where the absence of HB and council tax reduction might sort of have an impact on employment.
I'm not certain that that's true, actually, Gareth. Simply because I think universal credit has probably generated quite a lot of work for local authorities, extra burdens for local authorities. Mm-hmm. Would you say that, Laura?
Yes, I would. Sorry, I literally have just turned up, Malcolm, but I actually have to say that that's a conversation I was having last week with Tanya when I saw the email as well. And I actually welcome it, because the whole principles of a localised scheme, it's just doubled our workload.
Yeah. Naomi, do you want a last word on this before?
Yeah, it does move away from the government's localism, which was what council tax reduction scheme was all about. For us, we do tend to have a reasonably generous scheme. It's based on 100% of the liability. So unless that was being replicated, I think we would have some concerns.
I mean, we kind of also miss one of the issues of why it didn't go into council tax in the first instance, which was much the same complaints that was being made by landlords as well at the same time. It's not so much that that it would just simply be better. It was the expectation that people would pay their council tax. So the world has kind of changed now, because I guess probably, Gareth, you're thinking that under current universal credit, read it, they would just automatically make the payments to the local authorities if they made the award.
Not sure I follow that one, but I think if you're going to say that kind of local taxation ought to be under local control, then yes, fine. But I don't necessarily agree that therefore the supports for people that can't afford to pay the whole of that local taxation should also be different from a local area to local area, because that just opens up too much opportunity for fiddling, if you like, and bias and so forth. I think support for people who are short of their own resources is better handled at a kind of national and certainly at an integrated level.
But there are very few schemes across the world, are there, Gareth, where local taxation scheme is just run from a central government. I mean, almost certainly, if you have a local scheme, then the expectation is that any kind of support, it comes also locally.
Not necessarily. I mean, there are an awful lot of kind of national schemes that look at the whole person, if you like, or the whole household. That kind of holistic view of, well, these are what people's resources are, and these are what people's outgoings are, and in the way that means tested benefits always work. If you've got less than you need, we need to provide some kind of help. If you've got more than you need, then you're fine. When you have a very different kind of approach to people who've got exactly the same kind of needs from county to county or district to district in England, I think that's harder to justify.
Gareth, I think you've also got to consider, though, that a lot of different councils got completely different finance and income streams. You know, as a London borough, you might be easier to generate more revenue, for example, than an extremely rural area in Cumbria, for example.
Absolutely.
And I think we have to be mindful that if the government aren't going to support it and it's got to be locally funded, in our consultation in Oxford, we asked the question, do you want us to stop with certain services, or do you want us to raise the council tax charge? Because it literally is as fundamental as that. Do you want the swimming pool or the council tax reduction? Which one?
No, Laura, you're entirely right, and I think it's going back to the thing about if the government won't support you.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think the move to UC, or move back into what was going to be UC, would be more welcome, because it puts the onus back on to the national purse rather than the local one. I always find it bizarre, these things around business rates, where there are obviously very prosperous areas with lots of businesses and areas with lots less businesses, but then I don't understand business rates. I don't really understand council tax either, I suppose.
Well, that decision goes right back to the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was basically at war with Liverpool.
Yes.
Yeah. And in fact, actually, if I remember correctly at that time, Michael Heseltine did not agree with her. But then Michael Heseltine didn't agree with her on anything very much.
Yeah.
It's probably anyway. Just out of interest, is anybody on this call likely to respond back to this inquiry? And if you are, then the deadline is the 14th of January. So I'll just be a bit curious if anybody is going to respond. You are? Yeah. Are you going to it? Yeah, are you going to Cambridge, Naomi?
I have had a look at it. I really need to chat to the local taxation manager as well.
I'd be interested. I know Nikki Ducksworth is on the call. Is Entitled to going to respond? Just out of interest, because you've done quite a lot of work on council tax schemes.
I haven't heard anything about it. We're sort of involved in something else at the moment, but listening to it, I'll pop it over to Bill when I speak to him later, because it is quite relevant, isn't it? So.
Yeah, it is. I think we'll certainly be putting in a response to it as well. Right. Okay. Let's move on from this one. In fact, actually, I'm going to spend a bit of time discussing fraud and error. So I've got two sections, and and a sort of coda in the middle, which is the bounce back loans. But we didn't cover this one the last time we did, which is the level of fraud and error in the benefits system. Not surprisingly, almost doubled during the pandemic, from what was already the highest rates since records began. I find this a little bit difficult to say the highest rate since records began, because the Department of Work and Pensions have been qualified, I think, now for almost 30 years on their fraud and error figures. And I remember right back in, I think, 1990s, having a conversation with somebody from the National Audit Office, and I said, well, why don't you ever qualify them? And they say, well, it's because they're just obviously just making them up. But overpayments of benefits now stands at 8.3 billion, 7.5% of the Department's Work and Pension overall benefit expenditure, 111.4 billion, excluding state pension. I suspect that this is going to be the theme for next year. What do you reckon? Let's start with you, Liz. What do you think?
Yes, I could do no more but agree with you. I think it will be a big theme for next year and years to come.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been there. I mean, I was reading your slide earlier about whoever it was, the dripping tap. I mean, I think it's worse than looking at, well, for those of you who haven't seen the slide, basically they're equating fraud to a outside tap dripping, and you put a bucket underneath it, and effectively that bucket overflows 4 or 5 times before somebody empties it, which is quite a nice analogy. But I actually don't even think there's a bucket there. I think they just let the tap drip because it's outside.
Absolutely, Liz. I totally agree with you. Trust and protect, and they wondered why universal credit was so incorrect.
Yep.
It's also this kind of failure to disaggregate, if you like. They always put in fraud and error, and the effort and attention of the media always comes on the fraud, and never on the much larger error side of things. And they don't separate those out. They don't separate the error into the official error and the errors rather than fraudulent claims made by claimants. And they don't differentiate the organised fraud from the person that tries to forget that they've got a couple of £1,000 hidden under the mattress.
I don't disagree with anything you've said there. Yeah, I mean, this was quite often something that I used to raise, and actually, certainly in terms of the claimant error in its broader terms, actually, it used to be when the government did publish more detailed figures that you could see that the level of fraud was highest amongst pensioners, even though they were saying it was the highest amongst single parents. Well, that was quite obviously not true, which is of course one of the reasons why excluding pensions is quite an important thing. But the problem here is these numbers are big. I mean, even if the percentages are small, and I suspect that what we're really seeing this year are figures that probably look like normal years if they reported them more correctly. I remember when Frank Field was in charge of, was a minister in work and pensions, and he said the figure was more like 15%, not the 1.2, which I think they were reporting at that particular time. But he also said it would never be politically expedient for any government to have to admit to such a high level. But is there an issue here? I mean, Naomi, is there an issue between the difference between organised fraud and the chancy stuff, or is the chancy stuff more like the dripping tap?
I think that there's such a host of issues on all of this. I think that there's problem because of the lack of integrity in UC at the gateway. That was made worse by the pandemic. So I think there was some significant organised fraud in that area. Also, I think for us, fraud or claimant error, you're not likely to get anything through fraud because, DWP, since the Single Fraud Investigation Service, anything under £3,000 is compliance. Trying to get an investigation, certainly during the pandemic, is very difficult. Whereas we were pretty good, I think, when we had our own investigators, and we were able to do interviews under caution to identify something that was fraud and to categorise it. But also, I think, yes, there is still a big problem. There's a big problem with pensioners, as I hurtle towards being a pensioner myself. I do think that there are issues with that, in that capital remains a problem, occupational pensions remains a problem. But I think with VEP and HBAA and HBMS, I think big fraud within a payment cycle isn't so big. I do think gateway fraud and overpayments is the real problem.
Yeah, I mean that's actually always been the case, hasn't it, Laura? I mean, I remember from my days as a being in charge of fraud teams, about 75% was on passported fraud, was on passported benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an ex-fraud officer, for those of you who aren't aware, and I've already got my views. As soon as they got rid of the fraud departments to the DWP and siloed off councils, you lost a lot of local knowledge, local behaviours. Oh, it's that person again phrase that we used to always have in the fraud departments. When you lose that, then you change your processes of universal credit. And, I'm not going to lie to you, the DWP haven't processed housing benefit for so many decades. They were bound to be confused what is rent and how to check rent and what does rent actually mean. They just assumed it was quite simple. Well, guess what? No, it's not. So there was going to be error in there. Then obviously we've had COVID. Everybody's been moved to the front desk. Well, for those poor people, those customers that got a fraud officer, I bet they never got their claim paid. In comparison to other people that were frightened of a telephone, they probably just got everything paid because they're in panic. They're not a customer service officer. And I'm sorry, but customer services is a good skill set, and you've got to be good at interrogating people to get information out, to delve in, which is how error occurs then. And now we're in a massive backlog. So, where we were talking about large amount of numbers there of 8 billion, I'm not being funny. I think that's small, because I bet you they've probably got at least 100,000 referrals in their mailbox in Taunton they've not even looked at yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right, isn't it, Laura? I mean, the other thing is I know this feels a bit like a history lesson, partially because I think any conversation about fraud seems to be exactly the same conversation that I was having back in the 1990s and 2000s. It doesn't seem any kind of difference really in terms of both attitude and the rest of it. But the current fraud offences for welfare came into effect, I think they were signed by the Queen in September 1996, which does seem like a long way off now. But because I am now a pensioner, so I can remember stuff from 1996, but can't remember stuff from this morning. One of the interesting things about that was on the day that it was signed off, the DWP published a report, and that was a Social Security report number 24, I think it was. Which basically said there is no point in introducing additional offences for benefit fraud, since actually there was sufficient criminal offences for organised fraud, and for lower levels of fraud, all you did was you created basically more criminals rather than actually solving the problems. It also recommended very strongly not to introduce fines, because it just added to the burden that people on low incomes were already having, and being on a low income was much more of a driver to commit low-level fraud than anything else. Has any of that changed, do you think, Gareth? I mean,
I don't think any of the arguments have changed, no. And I think the whole kind of approach, certainly by DWP, has always been to pass the buck. Hence their kind of media-friendly emphasis on the fraud side of things and away from the error side of things, and their willingness to penalise people in a way that's just unsustainable.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, admin penalties have long been just a complete anathema to me. How would you recover that when you might have, I don't know, a debt that's, I know it's £100 a month, but going back 10 years? How the heck are you going to recover that with an admin penalty on top? And I know that we really hacked off our local DWP fraud department because I wouldn't sanction any unless it was for undeclared capital.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura, you've got an award-winning fraud team in Oxford.
We have.
How are they keeping busy?
They are keeping very busy. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I got my email from NFI the other day asking me about the SPD review because that's all due. And so from our point of view in Oxford, we are still dealing with fraud very seriously. I mean, I know in this time of COVID, you don't want to be talking about fraud, but as I keep pointing out, when you switch off, that's when it absolutely becomes prevalent in your area. So, you know, and I know that from their point of view, they work with other contracts and other councils dealing with it. But I think you have to be vigilant all the while. I don't think because there's a world pandemic, you should change your approach. Whilst, yes, you need to get the money out the door, it's still public money. And I'm sure that when they look at the ways and means of which we could have checked error, you know, other councils or other government agencies should have been diligent. I mean, you can't sit there and complain about ministers giving out all these contracts, you know, that are a bit dodgy on the side, but actually our internal working processes need to have that same review. So, I mean, I'm very keen on a very stringent approach, very audit based. I don't like money going out the door if it hasn't been checked by at least 3 people, because it's not my money. And if I don't make the money right, then the council goes down.
Okay, it's probably a good time to have a quick look at the bounce back loans. Some interesting figures published by the NAO this week. 1.5 million was the total number of loans issued under the bounce back scheme. But interestingly, 17 billion of that is what they've estimated will be the value of losses of the loans that won't be recovered. And it's interesting to see there that 6 million of that is the minimum value of fraud loans that the department expects the National Investigation Service. I'm always amazed these days. I've never heard of the National Investigation Service. It must be a name for something else, but there seems to be a lot of centralised fraud teams now with all sorts of different names. But
Malcolm, a lot of my stuff, I don't know if anybody else has had that, when we get in contact from fraud teams, it's not your local office. I had one from Blackpool the other day.
Yeah, that yes, I mean that doesn't surprise me at all. But is this kind of just plugging into what we've just been talking about? You know, the rush to get money out, the lifting of all of the traditional mechanisms of making certain that people get paid. Is this not going to be the theme for the government to want to recover as much of this money as possible? And where does that tend to lie in reality? Will it be the organised fraudsters that will be chased at court, or is it just much easier to go after the little person at the end? Liz?
I think traditionally it's always been much easier to go at the little person at the end. But I was quite interested in what Laura was saying. I agree completely about the fact that, of course, what actually has been lost through the single fraud investigation unit in relation to that is actually people on the ground, i.e. Laura's officers. I don't mean the fraud officers, but I mean the general officers lose the impetus to look at these things because actually they know that it won't be investigated. And there are, I mean, when we talk about small frauds, the small fraud, the little person at the end, if you know what you're doing and you look at it, potentially that little person at the end could be part of something much bigger. And in my experience from where the DWP single fraud investigation unit are simply not interested in that. They're not interested in those, shall we say, complicated housing frauds, rent frauds. So people lose interest, officers lose interest. They lose interest in reporting it.
Yeah, that is true enough. Certainly, if you don't think anything's going to be done, then that isn't. But I guess, Gareth, from a welfare rights point of view, actually, compliance is always much better and a much better deterrent and a much better way of dealing with things than fraud investigation, which is expensive because it's criminal.
Yeah, I think you have to differentiate between genuine fraud, and nobody's in favour of letting people get away with that, and the people who find themselves tarnished with a brush of fraud when it's just simply a mistake they've made because of the complexities of the system, and the artificial kind of differentiation that's sometimes made there. From my perspective, that there are also kind of real problems that occur between the court system and the benefit system. I'm in the middle of doing a quite complicated, going back 25 years case, where somebody was found guilty in court of quite substantial major fraud. When later on it got to the tribunal, it was determined that there was no fraud and they were entitled to the benefits anyway. That if you like, the criminal justice system doesn't understand the benefit system, and the order in which things get done can very often mean that the criminal case arises before the benefits appeal arises. And if the benefits appeal decides that there wasn't any kind of fraud and that people were entitled to the benefit, that doesn't override the previous criminal conviction. So there are these kind of issues that arise because the two systems don't work well together, I suppose.
I think, Laura, you and I both experienced this. I mean, this is much more about the magistrates' courts than it is about the High Court, really. The magistrates' courts never really come to grips with benefit. And in the old days, when there were weekly benefit incentive schemes like the old WIBs and such like, they kind of encouraged prosecution through the magistrates' courts, and the section 111A in the Social Security Administration made it very easy to get a conviction in the magistrates' courts because it didn't require any prior knowledge or any kind of mens rea for the 111A offence. The 1112, that's different. That's clearly criminal. But the other one was it was quite easy to get people in, and actually the way the system was set up, a lot easier if they turned up at the magistrates' court and said, yes, we've done it, because then they'd get a much lesser sentence. But that was your experience as well, Laura?
Absolutely. I mean, the magistrates don't understand benefits generally. They don't think it's like a major crime of theft and fraud. I think also the other problem is when the DWP get to there, they'd all start plea bargaining with you, saying, oh, it's time barred, we can't do this. How about we put it to the lesser offence? And you end up having these conversations with people and you go, do you know what? If you actually looked at the regulation and took this seriously, it would have a gravity about it. But of course, then there's the other issue of the old, what I would call the Daily Mail reader, that believes that one case of benefit fraud must mean that everybody's committing fraud on benefits. And it's that whole juxtaposition of going after those people that are committing 50, 60 grand's worth of fraud and having a test of reasonableness when it comes to the rest of it. I mean, now you don't get the DWP issuing ad pens, for example, and fining, you know, and there's a reluctance to do a caution. So their only option therefore is to do a prosecution. And then you've got this level of issue, you know, is it over £10,000? Well, then we're going to put it into the courts. They're not looking at mens rea and should that person have done this exactly the same thing 3-4 times over. But if it only comes to £5,000, well, that doesn't matter, because that's just a cost to the taxpayer, because the DWP are still investigating this and still looking at behavioural issues. But, you know, I just think that sometimes the court service do get the rough end of the stick, because sometimes it just gets lobbed into court, and other times I just think they shrug their shoulders and go, well, it's just benefits, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I guess probably what was going through my mind as you were speaking there is, you know, cases that we've had on appeal where I've said, yeah, you know, if the fraud team really want to go after this, they'll be much easier for them to get a conviction in the magistrates' court. But I'm never going to get this through an appeals tribunal.
Absolutely. Well, we had one, didn't we, where the ban was prosecuted and yet we lost the appeal. It completely bizarre case that was.
Yeah,
I still can't look at how we lost it.
But that's really kind of common, that kind of issue that I'm sure Malcolm has had the same experience as I have in trying to explain the way the benefit system works to criminal law barristers and solicitors who just sit there and boggle and say, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and
explain to them that unfortunately there's no regulation that says it should make sense.
Of course, one or two of them have been claiming universal credit over the last year. So they're learning from stuff. My
nightmare was always when I was sitting on Social Security appeal tribunals was the defence appearing with a high street solicitor. That was going to make the day very long and very painful.
Yes, I recognise that. So just to cover off, I did pick up as Liz had done the first slide. I won't go over that, but it was quite interesting to look at these numbers. So the government estimates that across the tax and welfare system, so you know, that's the you know, income tax, etc., and the welfare system, they lose really a total of about 26.8 billion a year lost to fraud. Now, I believe that is probably lost to fraud and error, as they say. But I mean, that's a big number. But it's interesting that the GCFF, which was set up in, I think, 2010 to try and collect fraud activity right across, counter fraud activity right across central government, they now estimate that there's about 25 billion a year is lost through fraud and error in other areas of government spending. And that was their point about the drip, drip, drip of the tap. They say, you know, that the measurement data that is available suggests that most departments are losing relatively small amounts to fraud and error every year, but these hundreds of small leaks all add up together. That's quite a lot of money. I mean, that's 26. I mean, we're talking about £50 billion a year. As Jake pointed out to me earlier today, you could pay for track and trace out of that.
You might also want to remember, though, that £16 billion a year in underpayment of means-tested benefits, excluding UC, should be in the equation somewhere. Yeah. And of course, the under half the disability benefits people are entitled to probably being claimed as well. So there are profits due to error, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, but I reckon if you started to add up on both sides of that equation, I think probably across government services, once you get into procurement in particular, and other areas, those numbers are going to rack up on the losses side. And also, in reality, it's not a straightforward, shouldn't be a straightforward exercise of just equating underpayment, you know, as offsetting fraud. But you could make that argument if you look at something that's very similar to fraud, which is basically shoplifting and petty pilfering in the retail industry. They've always said that when it gets to 6% of the overall turnover, then they do something about it. But anything other than 6%, it's just not worth their while to deal with it. It's just much easier to add it onto the price of the products, which I think is, starts to become that kind of glaring reality of fraud and error.
Yeah, but you're still conflating fraud and error, and generally error is higher than fraud, certainly in the benefits system by a long way. And yet the emphasis is put on the fraud side and not on correcting the errors, which in many cases will be simpler to fix.
Well, if only we had some kind of organisation, say some kind of benefit fraud inspectorate, that maybe could.
Or maybe a benefit error inspectorate.
Or maybe even, say something like, I don't know, maybe something like some sort of audit commission, perhaps.
Oh, no hope of that at all. No, I mean, they'd be taken so seriously if they ever did challenge somebody's figures. I'm sure that could never happen.
I think Ked's busy anyway.
But it does kind of bring that conversation around almost full circle. When you think that fraud and error has traditionally been the sole responsibility of each department, but actually there is much more advantage to actually having, because that gives you accountability. But actually, it would be much better to have it as a single investigation, because the one thing that we always knew when we investigated fraud, Laura, is that the criminals didn't see the boundaries, whether that was boundaries between different kinds of services or whether that was geographical boundaries. So they always could the organised fraudsters could always get ahead of the game.
Absolutely, and I think you'll find that, like someone said earlier, benefit fraud is usually the stepping stone to other stuff.
And I thought this was quite a shocking figure for me. I thought 16,000 people working in public sector counter fraud. That's an awful lot of people. 75% of that is in the DWP. 75% of that number is in the DWP. And it begs the question for me: what are they doing?
I was just about to say, really?
Mm-hmm.
Is it still 16,000 though?
How do you mean, Liz?
Well, it says it was established in 2018 as a means of bridging these gaps and bring together the 16 or so thousand people working in public sector counter fraud to share knowledge and practice. Is it still 16,000?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, in 2018 it probably was, but I expect that number may well have dropped considerably.
Probably to about 4 people.
And about to be racked up again, I suspect.
Just some back of the envelope figures. I mean, if that's 12,000 DWP people, well, that's what, 30 or so in every local authority area.
That doesn't sound unreasonable.
That's about right. Normally,
that would be my theory. Yeah. I mean, it was always the case. Local authorities tended to have much smaller teams, but actually managed to do much more about it.
Also, Gareth, they would have like a compliance team, they'd have a fraud team, then they'd have their specialist teams that come off of it that will deal with organised crime, then the ones that specialise in surveillance, then the ones that specialise in telecommunications, then they'd have their specialist financial assessment ones. I mean, it was a cottage industry for generating another job, yes.
Oh, the rabbits, yes.
Yeah, so the cost of fraud investigation has never really been qualified, and which was always the point that I used to make about this. I mean, Liz, you will remember me saying this very often, that the cost of investigating, something, even a reasonably decent bit of organised fraud could cost you far more to investigate it and prosecute it than it would for the amount of fraud that was taken out of the system in the first instance.
Yep. I do remember that. I think this line at the end is interesting, though, on your slide. I don't know. Although progress has been made, I've missed it now. Basically, they're saying it's still in its infancy, which to me is sort of, government speak for, well, we haven't got very far, and we don't really know what to do next.
Thing is, though, Liz, I mean, I'm not being funny. The tax office don't even see that fraud exists.
Well, no, I think the
They're only interested in income tax. They're not worried about tax credits, are they?
No. I think the whole thing is, yes, you're right, they don't. But I worry with HMRC, if they're still called that now. A lot of what they do, especially in error, for instance, when they make an error, it's always your fault as the taxpayer, and you are always compelled, one way or another, to pay it back. I mean, I've just had a tax bill for 2,000 quid because they mucked up a piece of information that they expected me to know, but it's quite complex. Actually, I did know. I sort of did know. I didn't know it was happening, but I understood what they're saying. But somebody who doesn't have any background in this sort of thing, they haven't got a clue when they're being overpaid or not. And whose error is it? It's mine.
We had the same problem at Oxford with salary sacrifice scheme. They sent through the wrong codes on salary sacrifice, and now we have a clump of staff within the council who have now got a tax bill that's huge.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So let's start to wrap this up because we've gone over there. There's another figure here: 7,000 recognised counter fraud professionals working across government, with 75% of these being in. So that's 16,000 is the 7,000 plus the support staff. And basically they're saying that the fraud estimate loss is between 0.5% to 5%. And that is just a really big range for them not to know how much fraud, which is why it remains in its infancy and has done so, I think, for the last 20 odd years.
Yep.
So on that basis, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you all very much for your contributions to the conversation. I thank you, Liz, Laura,
Pleasure.
Naomi, and Gareth.
Yes.
Forward to seeing you all next week. I think we've got a session due on the 20th, which I think I will cancel out of the diaries because that's a bit too close to Christmas. So I think we'll probably finish off round about the week before that, which would be about 13th, and then the next one would be in at something like we'll have to do it the week after we come back from Christmas because I think that's something like the 3rd of January, and everybody will be busy on the 3rd of January. So it'll probably be the 10th of January, something around there, before we have the next one. So there'll be a gap of about a month by the looks of it. Okay, so I'll see you all next week. Be really grateful if people could give me an idea about what you want to talk about. So that'd be.
Let's talk about benefits.
Yeah, okay. Come up with a specific, and we'll be glad to talk about that. And I think we'll probably be talking a bit more about council tax. I'm sorry, we do have to talk about council tax and business rates as well. All right, in which case I'll see you all next week. Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Yep. Have a good week, good weekend, good whatever day it is. Don't know. I'm a pensioner now.